Because the truth is, in a very different way, we still rely on each other for our survival, but it's easier not to know that. It's easier, like I sit here in my house, in my room, with my computer and my electricity and my blah, blah, and blah, blah, and I can feel like I'm very autonomous. But the truth is, I wouldn't have any of this without the millions and millions of people all over the globe that produce the things that I get to enjoy.
Welcome to Rebuilding the Village, a podcast that seeks to explore the causes of modern problems by examining the roots of our metaphorical village through the systems and structures in society that may have been disrupted in the technological and industrial era that we inhabit. Thank you for joining me today.
Well, my name is Phyllis Levitt, and I've been a psychotherapist for my, whole career as an adult, and I just retired from that last year. And I'm also an author, and I wrote 2 books called A Light in the Darkness and Into the Fire that are about my own personal healing journey and reconnection to my kind of most essential self. And then I've just written a 3rd book called America in Therapy, A New Approach to Hope and Healing, which really actually came from, my own connection to myself and a desire to share on a larger level what I have learned as a psychotherapist that I feel could really help heal the terrible divisiveness and threats of violence and escalating violence in America today, because I think the big missing piece is our collective mental health. What we advocate, what we condone, the disconnect between what we all want in our own lives and what we still allow and condone on larger levels be done to other people that we would never want to have be done to ourselves. And I see that as a mental health issue, not as an ideological issue, which is sort of what we've been conditioned to believe.
There's an element of how I suspect, like, just being brutally honest, I know you talked about sexual abuse when you were a child in the book,
Right.
that when people hear that, I think there's this go-to to think that, oh my God, this is a horrible person. He just came into existence as a horrible person, and this is just what it was. Or the parents were just horrible people and they were just born that way. But I think in the context of this podcast that I'm doing, that like the idea of the village that we're trying to rebuild is this multi-generational machine
Right.
that tries to produce people that can quell their darker impulses and encourage their more positive impulses. And then when there's a disruption in that machine, you start to produce people, like, even in the best of societies, you're always going to have some bad apples that slip through, but it shouldn't be getting to such large numbers as it is today.
Right.
And so where do you feel like that this may have started from in case of your family? Like, where did I think it was your father you mentioned that was sexually abusive to you.
Actually, it was my mother.
It was your mother? Okay, it was your mother. I misread that.
That's as far as I recall. So what I would say, and I really like the point that you brought up, because I think that's so important for us to understand on a large level, that what we learn gets passed down. If there's no interruption in the cycle of abuse or neglect or negative messages that we're given that we internalize, if there's no interruption, if there's no rescue, if there's no treatment or help for the things that we've experienced that are really painful and hurtful, then they tend to repeat themselves in some ways. And as you said, we produce more and more people who are hurt by some of our larger policies that affect, thousands and millions of people. But in my case, I believe that my mother was the first girl born after 6 boys, and then she had one more sister. And I think it was I don't know that much about her family. She never really talked that much about it, but I think it was chaotic, and they came out of the Depression, and I don't actually really know exactly how the household was run, but from things that my mother said kind of indirectly, I got the sense that she had been sexually abused, perhaps by some of her brothers. I don't know that for a fact. But my mother was odd in terms of her female identification. And I think she had a lot of her own unresolved issues. And I think I was the recipient of that. I don't know about my brother and sister, but I'm pretty clear that I was abused very early on in my life, and it affected my whole life.
Yeah, and you talk about in the book how you had this urge, almost like this inner urge to scream or yell like multiple times throughout your life, but you couldn't. I think it's a very common
Right,
misconception around things like assault, sexual abuse, any kind of trauma in childhood is that you'll tell people about this and they'll think, well, why didn't you do something? Why didn't you say
right,
something? And it's just like, you don't understand the feeling of like your body turning you off, like numbing you out, like disconnecting. These people talk about like people have talked about sexual abuse and things like that, or maybe like sexual assault. It's almost like an out of body experience. Like you're literally
right,
disconnecting from yourself while it's happening. So it's not like
right.
you didn't want to do something; it's that you just literally couldn't because there's this internal wiring that was overtaking you. And then it starts to create these ripple effects through your life where you start to attract or gravitate towards people that you're trying to heal an internal wound with an external source. And I
It's
know you
so true.
mentioned,
It's so
yeah,
true. You sometimes are attracted to people who will hurt you in some similar way because the unconscious attraction is you're trying to get love from that person and you're still trying to get love from the person that hurt you. And so there's an inner unconscious drive to get it from somebody like the person that hurt you. It doesn't make logical sense, but psychologically it totally makes sense. If
yeah,
that make if
yeah, internally, because like I think it's your unconscious way of thinking is very different from your conscious. Like your logic and your emotions are two separate pathways, and very
Right,
often people make the mistake of not realizing is that your emotions will trigger something, and your logic will try to justify your emotions. So when you say
right.
something like, "No, this makes perfect sense that I'm with this abusive guy," well, why? Like because subconsciously this reminds me of maybe my father or my mother or some kind of childhood thing that I'm trying to, without realizing, trying to rectify and rewrite the story, but inevitably the story keeps getting repeated over and over and over again.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. And I know in your case, you mentioned how you went to a lot of gurus and ashrams. I think
Yeah.
I see people, there's a line in the book I really liked, and I have a million lines in the book that I ended up underlining, but I couldn't get them all. Um, Part of faith is to allow yourself to enter unknown space without a satisfaction guaranteed sign on the door. And I
Mm,
think a lot of people will bounce
mm,
between different religions, different spiritualities, different things like that, trying to again fill that internal hole with an external substance.
right.
And I believe you mentioned you were raised in a quote unquote relatively traditional Jewish household.
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, for the time that I grew up, my parents, I was born right after the Second World War
Hmm.
ended. And I think, everybody was kind of reeling from what happened, especially in Nazi Germany. And I think the way that they coped was just to put a lid on the whole thing and not talk about it and not want to feel it and not remember. And I think, and I also think people really didn't know that you need to process the traumas that you've experienced. I think they thought burying it was the way to go.
Yeah, that's a very common thing. I do massage therapy for a living, and I have a lot of people that will. I've had a couple times. I've had people come into my practice who have had like anxiety attacks over things that they didn't realize were still kind of bubbling up inside them, or
Right.
they'll try to normalize something crazy. Like they'll
Hmm.
come in and say something like, "Well, like my dad beat the crap out of me, but that's just life, right? Whatever."
Right.
Like you almost want to be like, "That's not just life. Like that you're trying to push away the feeling of like I kind of want to cry about this and I want to scream and I want to punch the table and I want to put a hole in the wall and I want to just like yell at the top of my lungs, but I have to be a civilized adult, and that's not what we do as civilized adults. But in reality, there is some unlocked, unchecked emotion still caked up somewhere in your brain that needs to get out. And like you said, with
Right.
the post World War II and like things like that, is that a lot of people the norm across a lot of Western society became about repression. That like
Right.
we just don't talk about it, and if we don't talk about it, then it's not real. If it's like denying, it's
Right.
suppressing, it's repressing, and how it's like it's gonna come out whether you want it to or not. And you're better
Exactly.
off doing it in a way that is you'd rather like get water from your faucet rather than water from a fire hose to fill up your cup.
Right. Right. And it's important to be able to get it out in a safe place. And I think for many people like myself with another person who was safe, because I think it's really hard to process that kind of stuff by yourself. And I think for many people it actually won't come all the way to consciousness unless there's some safe container around you. And that's not always true. But I think that's one of the beauties of having really good psychotherapy is that there's a safe container and another person there with you. So because most of us were in a sense alone when the traumatic things happened to us. There was nobody there to protect or intervene or stop it. And to have someone there helping you process it helps break that trance of isolation around the trauma.
Having someone there too, and sometimes it doesn't always have to be a person, because I know you in the book you talk a lot about like the desert and Mother Earth, and how that
Absolutely.
was like you may not have had somebody, but you kind of did have somebody. And
Hmm.
sometimes people lose the context of like, well, I don't feel comfortable talking to anyone. Like, well, then go out into nature and just walk
Right.
around and talk. Put your hands on the
Right.
ground and just like speak your mind, and like the birds and the trees and the forest, everything, wherever you are, like they're listening. They'll talk to you. They'll if you need
Right.
to. That's one
Right.
way of doing it.
And it can be a great source of like comfort. There's something, for me anyway, there was like an incredible connection and comfort in nature that
Yeah.
at that time in my life when I was younger, especially, I really didn't have anywhere else.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I wonder too, in the case of this is an interesting thing I've talked about recently. We were talking about how, by modern day standards, it's very bizarre, not only for people to be living in like isolated households, where it's like maybe back in the day, it's like it wasn't unusual to have like your grandparents and your parents
Right.
and you living all on the same roof. And then within the last 50, 70, 80 years, it was like everyone has to get out by themselves. And now that
Right.
people are starting to like, it's so expensive, we can't live on our own. But I think there's a benefit to then being encouraged to having those multi-generational things. But even in the context of like a small house, like you said, in the case of like your sexual assault, is that like you may have been, I don't know if you had your own bedroom growing up, but
I had a
oftentimes
bedroom
even
with
in
my
the
sister.
yeah, even the case of a house like that, even though everyone's in the same house, you're all in separate rooms. And there's so
Hmm.
much isolation from room to room where so much can happen behind closed
Hmm.
doors that nobody would understand what's happening.
Totally. And I think the emotional isolation was just as much as, as big or bigger, because we never talked about anything.
Mm.
And I have I have many, many memories of crying alone in my room and no one coming because that's just what they did. They didn't come. So the emotional isolation was pervaded the space, actually.
I've heard the crying alone thing reminds me of, I think it was in the 1980s, there was a book that came out about something about letting your kids cry it out. Like letting little babies and little kids cry it out. And it was just like, let's just leave them alone. They'll tire themselves out eventually. But
Right,
the counter argument to that is like, well, you also don't want to be an ultra helicopter parent where you're attending to every single thing they do, because sometimes they could just be lying and they want attention. But figuring out where's the balance.
right.
And I think we kind of swung the pendulum a little bit too far in one direction versus the other. And now you're starting to see a lot of interesting research coming out talking about how like emotional the term I think is emotional co-regulation, where like we should have some degree to regulate our own emotions internally, but there's also an element where you need somebody else there with you. That like when you're a
Right.
little kid and you want attention or you cry or something's wrong, them giving you a hug, physical contact, skin to skin contact is like the best way, better than any SSRI or antidepressant drug can do to just calm down your nervous system and quell your
I
brain.
agree. I agree. I agree. And I
Yeah.
think we really need to internalize that in order to be able to self soothe, because there has to be some imprint of being soothed that you learned.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And I think this is something that I think it's funny by today's standards is that we still haven't really evolved or adapted to the industrial society we live in. I guess is
Right.
what I say. We were basically an agrarian society prior to the past, we'll say, I don't know, 300 years or so. And we were all living on farms, but that there was these systems and structures in place that were there that we didn't realize were there, that when we started this new day and age and way of doing things, especially with a lot of the factories, a lot of the urban to suburban, like from going from rural to urban, or not urban, so rural to urban way of living, that we really disrupted a lot of the processes, and we're still innovating and trying new things faster than we can recognize and realize that we're causing damage in certain ways.
And I think, just to add to that, and maybe this is actually what you're referring to, is that, with all the benefits of technology and all the amazing things that we've been able to create, I think we've also created this illusion that we don't need each other
Yeah.
as much, and that is such a profound trauma to the human psyche, because we really do need each other. And the things that people come to therapy for, the tremendous pain that people bring, that I've been a witness to and worked with people for so many people for so many years, all has to do with the deficits of love and belonging and safety in our human relations. It has nothing to do with what you got. You got a new toaster or a new TV, or you were able to buy a new car. The pain is all about injuries to love and belonging for the most part, and safety.
I'm not a therapist, but massage therapist, so I'm 50% there. I've had plenty of people that come in and I'm just like, my neck is tension, my shoulders are bothering me, and my husband's driving me nuts, and my kids are up my ass right now, and my boss said I
Right,
want to kill him. And then they just talk for 30 minutes to an hour, and afterwards like,
right,
my tension's gone. You're an amazing therapist, massage therapist. Like, I just
right,
listened. I literally just
right.
listened to you talk, and your body was like, oh good, you're not alone. Somebody's here with you right now. And there's a very
Hmm.
big theme, especially in men nowadays, where even for myself, it took me a long time to really realize this, is that like we're not designed to be lone wolves. Anybody.
That's right. We're
We're
not.
not, yeah, we're not supposed to be doing things on our own. We're supposed to, there is an element of competitiveness that can be helpful amongst people, especially maybe men more than women, maybe because of testosterone and things like that. But for the most part, you're really, yeah, like anything you do, like accountability partners, having people in your life that are like, people that are watching out for the best in you, and not judging yourself for not being like, and like the idea of the self-made man or self-made woman
Right,
is
right,
such a myth. It's
right.
ridiculous. Like, nope, like,
Hmm.
especially with things like social media nowadays, where people have this impression of like, wow, this guy got a Lamborghini by the time he's 25 years old, all by himself, doing this one simple trick. I must be doing something wrong. I'm a terrible person. And it's
Right,
like,
right,
he's faking
right.
it. And he has a team of like 100 people, and it's like $100,000 business that he did through scamming people. And it's a complete myth.
Hmm. Hmm. And that's the goal. That the goal is to be a self-made man rather than um, to be in cooperation and collaboration for the greater good, both of yourself and for other people. And I think that's psychologically, if we look at an individual family, that's what makes a healthy family. There's a sense of the good of the whole, not just the good of one individual.
Yeah.
And when you have a family where one person takes all the power, or everything's about them, then you have an unhealthy family, and you have people that are suffering from not having gotten the love and care and sense of belonging that they really needed. And this is happening on such a widespread level across society and across the country of America today, where so many people are being left out and targeted for deprivation and abuse or shame, or being seen as inferior, or being judged, or being exploited. And so we, from my point of view, then we're just creating masses of symptomatic people. And then we wonder why we have so many symptomatic people, rather than, can we look at the family dynamics in the individual family and on the collective level and try to heal them?
Hmm. Yeah. And I think I've heard a lot of pushback from people that have this misconception around other traditional societies. Like, a good example is like there's a lot of animosity, we'll say, between America and China right now. And the go-to when people think of that is something like, oh, communism. Yeah, you're not wrong. But one thing that is a big part of their strength is the fact that they are very ingrained into the family unit. They really value like
Mm,
multi-generational. There's a respect for, this is a big one, is that there's a respect for people that are older than you for having experiences that you have not experienced yet, and that you should like take the time to listen to somebody talk because they might know something you don't. And maybe when
Mm-hmm.
you go through like your teenage years, you're rebellious, you're naturally kind of pushing your boundaries. That's literally built into our genetics in a way. That we want to kind of carve our own space, carve our own territory. But I think nowadays that message gets amplified 1,000-fold through social media, because it's like, oh, I'm a rebellious teen, my parents are telling me what to do, but I can find 100,000 other kids who are thinking the exact same way I'm thinking, which must mean I'm right. You don't realize it till you're in your mid-30s. You're like, wow, I was a complete idiot growing up. Why did nobody tell me this? Holy crap!
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
then it's just, almost like the damage is done by that point. That you miss out on those
Yeah.
opportunities. Yeah.
And I think you add to that, and maybe it's part and parcel of it, that we have this obsession with youth. And so people don't want to age, and they don't want to look like they're aging. And so we don't have a context in which the wrinkles in your face mean that you've lived a long life and you have lots of experiences, and what do you want to share? It's more like, get rid of those wrinkles. Even if you're 90, get rid of them. You know.
I think like
Um,
Madonna right now looks, I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of her, but like a lot of celebrities are doing the same thing where it's like, I need a nose job, I need this, I need that. And it's just like, it's a never ending game of trying to outdo every other person out there. And this is an
right,
interesting context when it comes to things like you mentioned, things like judging and shame and comparing.
right,
And I would say it's not a bad thing in contained doses, because it's like if you're a
right,
little kid and you push a little kid and knock him over and everybody makes you feel bad for doing that, but we kind of want you because we don't want you pushing people over. But
right.
if you make a mistake and all of a sudden it's amplified through Instagram and Facebook and the internet, and it's echoed 100,000 times into the rest of your life, you're terrified of making mistakes now. And then everyone else around
Mhm.
you is also terrified of making mistakes. Like even in this podcast, there's like been times I want to talk about certain things. I'm almost like, it's not even posted yet. I hope I don't get canceled. This is going to be crazy. Like cancel
Right.
culture is really kind of suppressing innovation and fear of having open debates around certain things, because we're creating this world where on the one hand, it's like it's like a middle ground. You should have a little bit of like comparison is not bad if it makes you a little bit better, but it's like I shouldn't be comparing myself to David Beckham or Elon Musk or something like that. That's a little bit way out of
Mhm.
my reach right now. But I
Mhm.
could be comparing myself maybe with some guys down the block or at the gym. It's like, okay, that guy's in pretty good shape. Maybe I could do a couple extra sets today. But then if I compare myself to like a Arnold Schwarzenegger, like I feel like crap because I'm never going to look like that. And you start to
Mhm.
amplify this effect of people just not having enough of a contained space to like step into those opportunities in a gradual manner.
Well, also not. I mean, we're so appearance oriented, and that's part of what traumatizes people, is that they can never look perfect.
Mhm.
And we don't have to. How do we come back to a place where we actually care just about who you are? Just who you are and who I am in relationship to you, not how big my nose is or how gray my hair got. But like, who am I for you, and who are you for me, and how do I want to treat you? And do I want to get to know you the way I want to be known? Are we treating people? This is really the bottom line. Are we treating people the way we want to be treated?
Mhm.
Who do you know that wants to have their city bombed to smithereens and their relatives all killed? No one. Who do
Right.
you know that wants to be discriminated against because of the color of their skin or their religion or their gender identity? Nobody wants to be discriminated against. And so the more we live in that culture where we're so judgmental and we're so surface oriented about comparing ourselves and judging what's better and what's worse, the more we're likely to project our fears and our shadow onto other people. As long as somebody else out there is the one that's excluded or less than, then I don't have to worry about it being me. And of course, we don't think that. It's just all happens unconsciously, that shadow and that fear just gets projected onto other people, and that allows us to target them. And that's what's happening all over the
Yeah.
world, really.
I wonder historically what were the systems and methods that would attempt to prevent that, like you said, that projection of the shadow. I think it's like a Carl Jung terminology. That inevitably throughout all of history and time, there's always been conflict of some sort, and that
Right.
would just be drawn back to like maybe our days as advanced monkeys that were just like, were territorial. Even in the context, it's very funny. This is a really good book. It's called The Naked Ape. And it's basically a book about the zoologist who's doing like a breakdown analysis of human beings as though it's like a brand new species that he's looking at. And it's really cool how he does a good job of interpreting like certain behaviors that we have in day-to-day life, how we think we're really super complicated when in reality we're not really that far off from like our ancestors in a way. And a good example of that would be like territorialism, where it's like, if you're you're a homeowner, that's your property, that's your territory. You don't want people encroaching on it. If you're a kid and you have a bedroom or something like that, like that's your territory. You don't want them encroaching on that. But in the case of projecting in the shadow with, racism and sexism and things like that, and inter-country conflict and things like that, it may have been that there was inevitable like a certain amount that was kind of, but I wonder if it's like something that's always been there but been relatively contained and is now being explosive in today's day and age, or because of things like social media, or if there were just certain systems and things in place within old school systems of the village and the community and back in the farming days that would keep it relatively in check so that it doesn't get explosively out of control, so we don't have things like the Cold War where we almost nuked the entire planet.
Right. And I don't know the whole answer to that, but one of the things that I think of when you say that is that in the far distant past, we just really relied on each other for our survival. People shared, they built their villages together, or they hunted and shared the meat, or, whatever they did. And when I think when you're living just in survival mode, or that's the focus, how you're going to eat today, how you're going to protect yourself from predators, then I don't think there's room for the kind of acquisition for more that modern technology and all of the ways that we've produced agriculture and, villages and protection and weapons, especially, that I think that there's, if we just use the word addiction, I think we've become addicted to more and more and more, and it's never enough.
Yeah.
And I think that's just something that we have to look at in our own psychology, that it's really an addiction to more that makes other people extraneous. Because the truth is, in a very different way, we still rely on each other for our survival, but it's easier not to know that. It's easier, like I sit here in my house, in my room, with my computer and my electricity and my blah, blah, and blah, blah, and I can feel like I'm very autonomous. But the truth is, I wouldn't have any of this without the millions and millions of people all over the globe that produce the things that I get to enjoy. And I think we have to really come to understand, on a psychological level, not just on the material plane, that we really rely on each other's mental health and well-being, because it's when people are treated terribly by other people, when they're bombed out, when they're hated for their race, when they're deprived of the necessities of life, or someone has stolen the resources from their land, that they're going to be symptomatic. And some of them are going to become violent and angry as a response. And we're not safe from them. How did people become terrorists? How do they become terrorists? Do we ask ourselves that question? How did a little baby who was born innocent and pure and only needing, only wanting love and food and affection and belonging and safety, how did that person become a terrorist? Something happened to them that totally distorted their relationship to themselves, their own humanity, and other people. And that's something that happened to them from other people.
You mentioned in your book, I think it was just the discussion around misinterpretation of evil. And it was actually I forget the exact term. It was the dark side of consciousness. What was it? It was when you mentioned like evil and the devil and Satan. And it is interesting how they, in those cases with those people, that like, I think there's almost a built-in systems to us that kind of prevent us after a certain point, not only systems within us, but also within a society, that prevents us from succumbing to the urge to do terrible things. It's like you might have an urge to, you get into, if you're having a scuffle or a discussion with somebody, and there's an urge that comes up that you want to punch that guy, or you want to strangle that person. You don't listen to it because
Right.
there's like, not only is there people around me that would judge me harshly and kick me out of the group if I did that, but also internally I just feel like there's something stopping me. But it's interesting how you can create a system where like that feeling can be grinded into dust on an
Absolutely.
individual level, and then you can scale it en masse to then create a terrorist group or to create like crazy things that go on. And it's interesting. Like the one thing that's popping in my mind right now, at least on a very small individual level, is something like the Columbine shootings, and how like a lot of times if I've discussed it with people, they're just like, well, those kids were crazy and it was the video games and they were just this. And it's like there's so much more to it than just that. Like
Right.
the whole, there must, I think this is very common. Anybody's like listening to this can basically say like, I'm willing to bet if you were to think back to your time in middle school or high school and I asked you, who do you think would be most likely to be the one that like would go postal and bring a gun to school, you could probably find that person in less than 30 seconds in your head. And everybody in the school knew about them, and the teachers knew about them, and the parents knew about them, and no one did a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me wonder, like, is that a more commonplace thing nowadays, where we're getting to a point where we're becoming so separated from each other, even though we have more communication than ever through things like social media and technology, that it's becoming easier and easier and easier to demonize a person that you don't have the opportunity to actually really get to know.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that is one of the big issues in the psychological makeup of ourselves, in our families, and in our communities, and as nations, and really globally, is that we're so quick to judge and blame people for their symptoms rather than looking deeply into what caused their symptoms. Because there's a cause for those symptoms. Those, I don't know the whole story of the Columbine kids, but I did read a little bit about the Uvalde shooter, and what I remember reading was that when I think he was in either first grade or kindergarten or something, when they went back and interviewed the teacher that he had, the teacher said that he was a wonderful little kid. And then by the time he was in third grade, he had been bullied. I think he had a speech impediment, maybe. He had been bullied. He had been, kind of ostracized. There were questions about whether there had been some abuse that had happened in his family. He apparently had told someone that he had been abused. And he was already being called the school shooter before this happened. So what happened to him between kindergarten and first grade and third grade? What happened was that he was stigmatized and bullied and hurt in maybe ways that we will never fully know. But something happened that caused that rage and that pain and that disconnection that made him want to act out. Apparently, and I believe this is true, what I read was that the classroom that he shot up was the actual room he had been in as a little boy. So, talk about, the trauma just being exploding, the pain and the rage exploding. And how do we not just how do we identify people before they do this, which of course is very important, but how do we keep it from happening? How do we help families? How do we help kids who are already being identified as, being left out or being bullied or being symptomatic in some other way? And how do we redirect some of our resources to providing more care and more treatment and more family intervention with the idea of helping people, not just blaming them?
I think the one thing that pops into my mind is like intergenerational conflict, and because like you don't want to go up to a parent like that and tell them you're raising your kid wrong. We need to tell you how to raise your kid. But oftentimes I imagine like in the case of like the school shooting you mentioned and like Columbine and things like that, this problem probably started like 70, 80 years ago or 100 years ago, prior to the actual event happening. And this is a tough thing I hear. I was talking to my sister is a school teacher, and she's like, I've had a lot of teachers who come to my practice for massage therapy, and a lot of them across the board, totally different schools, totally different things they teach. They're all saying the same thing, that the kids are just like out of control nowadays, like completely off the cuff, just like no discipline, no manners, no this, no that. And then the question is always like, how do we fix this now? And I'd be like, my question is like, well, yeah, we can fix it now, maybe, but then also, how do we prevent it from happening again?
Right.
And if you go back, you keep going back further and further and further. One thing I remember hearing repeatedly while I was doing a lot of this research around it was this idea that if you don't have a kid that is socialized properly by the age of like 3 to 4 years old, the odds of them being lifelong like menace to society, criminals, gonna fall into like can't socialize properly, and then they can't socialize properly, they're not getting interpersonal needs met and community and things like that. The odds of them basically going off the deep end are really high. So then I ask the question like, well, why are these kids not being socialized at a young age? And then oftentimes it's because even in today's society, especially in the West, that we have to have 2 income households, but if both
Right.
parents are working, then who's
Right.
watching
They're
the
not
kids?
home.
Either no one's watching the kids, or they're going to daycare where they're one of like 15, one of 20 kids. They're not getting the attention that they need. And there becomes this recurring theme of like the abundance thing you mentioned before, where it's like, well, we want more, we want more, we want more, but at what cost? And
Right.
there's a really good proverb, but it wasn't from the book. It was take what you want as long as you're willing to accept the price. And I think a lot of times nowadays, people are not recognizing that your decisions to do things have costs in ways that you can't readily see. And a good example might be like, I had interviewed a financial coach recently about the state of America and their relationship with money. And she said the amount of times that I've worked with people that both parents are working, the kid's in daycare, and if one parent stopped working and they stopped putting the kid in daycare, they'd make the exact same amount of
Mhm.
money. The exact
Wow.
same. But there's this
Wow.
idea of like, you have to have a career or you're a bad person. And it's like,
Right.
you have a career, but then your kid is suffering. Or maybe historically you had a career, but you lived with your grandparents. So while you were working the day, kids were with the grandparents. So maybe there's an intergenerational thing we mentioned earlier, like the household multi-generational, but now the grandparents
Right.
are all moving to Florida and places, or they're going to overseas, and they're separating from their families. And then there's no one around because it takes a village to raise a child, which is where this podcast actually kind of comes from.
Totally.
That
Totally.
something is being priced out somewhere, and the cost is usually the next generation. And then at one point, is
Right.
this teapot going to explode, basically?
I think that's absolutely true. And the cost is our emotional and mental well-being. And it shows up in our behaviors toward ourselves and toward other people. And you can legislate all you want. You can build all the prisons you want, but all you will do is produce more victimized people who live miserable lives and tend to pass that on to the next generation. A really big theme for me is that I think we have to, among many, is that I think we have to really look towards what it would take to fund rehabilitating people, giving people the help they need. Because as true as it is that our early life is very, very formative in terms of what we learn about ourselves and how to treat other people and the expectations and the role models and all of that, and the injuries can run really deep from early in life, people also can heal.
Yeah.
They can heal with the right help, with being cared for, with someone who looks at them and doesn't see just the worst that they've done, but sees the essence of who they were before anything happened to them, and treats that and sees that and exemplifies that as part of the healing process. People can heal. That's the whole point of psychotherapy. People come with amazing pain and injury. I mean, I've heard abuse stories that are hard to believe, but I believe them. They're true. It's hard to imagine people treating their own children or their relatives that way. Um, and our survival, our ability to rebound is also incredible given safety and the right healing environment. And so I think we have to accentuate that even there's I don't know if you ever read Father Boyle, Greg Boyle. He's a priest who made his career working with gang members in LA, and out of his commitment to his religion, and he ended up starting a program called Homeboy Industries, and he has made community and jobs and services and therapy and drug treatment and all these things available for people who had miserable childhoods, grew up in gangs, or grew up with addiction, or grew up with, their parents leaving them alone when they were little tiny children, or who have had terrible abuse, and who have even committed terrible crimes, and brought love and safety and community, and had incredible success with rehabilitation. And so we have to know that people are salvageable, and we have to look at them that way.
Yeah, I think there's a there's a good book. I believe it's called Thinking Fast and Slow. And what it does, it talks about how your brain essentially has two different systems of problem solving circuitry in it. One is like the very, very quick, like you can do quick math in your head, 2 + 2 is 4, 5 times 5 is 20, whatever it is. That but it also is the same circuitry used for coming for quick decisions about a person or a circumstance that you're in based on what you're doing. So if you're walking down the street and you see a really like a tough guy walking the opposite direction, he looks really tough and big and muscle has covered in tattoos, your instinct is like, I'm just going to make sure I steer clear of him. He might be deep down the nicest guy ever, but in that moment, you don't have the time to say, I wonder if this guy is actually really a sweetheart if I gave him a couple years of therapy and a big hug. You have to just jump to the moment and say, like, I have to make a decision in less than 3 seconds. This is what I'm going to go with based on historical evidence and things I've seen. Probably better to just steer clear for now. But I think when you take that and you start to exaggerate it on a societal scale, you start to get everybody to start like, and this is what happens with like the 24-hour news cycle. And I think this is why podcasting is starting to become very popular, is that how do you take an event, or even like politics does this a lot, how do you take the complexity of a human being and boil it down to 15 seconds or 30 seconds? And in doing so, you miss out on all the nuance of who they are, where they came from, what their life was like, maybe what their dreams, what their talents are, what their aspirations are, the circumstances they were born into, and just reduce it to, oh, that guy's just crazy. That's it. That's the diagnosis. He's crazy. Right. He's just, there's nothing. And granted, I have a bit of like a theory I've heard where I think like maybe 0.1% of the population are people, like 0.01% of the population are people that are genuinely born from some evil dimension that we're never going to be able to know where it came from or whatever. Like they're just like demonic.
Or there's
99.9%.
Something wrong neurologically that has created that in a very small fraction of people. Right.
And then they tend to be, I think even with the case of crime statistics, I think it's like 60 to 70% of the crimes are committed by the same people. But then when you start to generalize, like, okay, we could say in this particular community, there's a very high crime rate. It's only 10 people who are doing it. But everyone in the community is all Black or Hispanic or white or Asian. Therefore, that type of person is now more likely to commit crimes because you're generalizing rather than realizing like there's a lot of value in the individual in that.
Statistics that show that more than 50% of people who are incarcerated today have unhealed child abuse. So, and I remember I worked in a sexual abuse treatment program when I first got my degree, and we had someone come and speak to us from a dual diagnosis treatment center. And they saw the same thing, people who were suffering from addiction. Dual diagnosis means you're treating the addiction and you're treating the underlying emotional symptoms and diagnosis. And more than 50% of the people they were treating for addiction had unhealed child abuse. So that's why we really have to look at what's happening in the family and what are the influences from the family of America that are now so intense, through the internet, through news, that are really part of the conditioning now of our young people and people growing up, and of course the adults as well. There's the influences coming in on us, the role models of it's okay to target people, or those people really are all thugs and rapists or whatever they are, all those people, rather than looking at them as individuals who may have been hurt or who are just in need.
Yeah, and I think this is where these societal systems that would act as almost like a safety net, I suppose is one way to say it. Whereas like growing up as a kid, ideally in your formative years, in your early years, you had your parents around. But if you didn't have your parents around, you had your grandparents around. But if you didn't have your grandparents around, you had your cousins around or your neighbors or something like that. And we're creating this world where it's becoming
Right.
so ridiculous. It's becoming almost to some degree impressive that like we've managed to, let's say, mess up the like if a kid is falling caught by their parents were there, grandparents were there, the neighbors, the cousins, the aunts, the uncles, somebody. And I've had a lot of people I've talked to in my practice who like usually if they're over like 50-ish, they'll mention how like growing up, my grandparents were 2 blocks away, and my aunts and uncles were over there. My cousins I'd play with were right across the street. Or we'd have like all the kids would be playing out in the street together, having fun. And now the entirety of people, not the entirety, but the vast majority of people nowadays are just getting communication, and their sense of community is going online.
Right.
But they don't realize that there are certain like things in your wiring and your structuring in the way that that a human being grows up and becomes an adult and matures, that you need physical interaction, social interactions,
Right.
playtime as a kid,
Right.
and how it's being more and more pulled away from the traditional family unit.
And the thing that really strikes me and was part of the motivation for writing my book is that, as human beings today, especially with all of our technologies and the things that we love about our technologies and that we actually count on to survive, our computers, our cars, our air conditioning, whatever it is that we really need and want, if they're not working, we're right away all over it. Call the computer guy, get the refrigerator guy out there, buy a new one, get a better car that goes faster or has more perks in it, whatever it is. We're all over it if any of our devices don't work. And we don't feel any shame about calling the computer guy to fix our computer, right? In fact, we feel like we have to have that. But when it comes to our human psyche and our human relations, when people explode, we blame them. We don't blame the computer. We go get help. But when people explode, when they hurt themselves, when they hurt their children, when they fail to thrive in some way in their work life or in their community, we blame them and we target them and we punish them instead of looking for what caused the explosion or implosion.
Yeah, there's a good book. It's called The Hypomanic Edge. And what it does, it basically talks about the children of manic depressive people or had some genetic lineage to that. But what's interesting is how they basically make a point that most likely America, in conjunction with like the fossil fuel revolution and oil and whatnot, how to really transform our ability to produce energy to do things, that a lot of the people who are ultra successful that did crazy things, and they talk about like William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, one of the earlier settlers. They talk about Andrew Carnegie, a couple of people modern day and age through the same thing, that like they are just naturally speaking, they're just like almost psychotic, like obsessive workaholics. They can work like 18 hours a day like nothing, sleep for half an hour, wake up, and then just keep going. And that can be helpful in any society and group when you have like one or two people who are like that because they're curious, they're innovative, they want to try new things, they're pushing technology forward. Great. The problem, I think, comes down to the fact that when 99% of the population doesn't fall into that category, but everyone feels like they have to keep up, then you start having this sense of like you have to work, you have to be working crazy hours, you have to be doing overtime, you have to make a lot of money. And I've noticed even in my practice, I've had a number of people come through in the past who have like really solid careers and like broken home lives, or their kids, their kids are just not doing well. They're into drugs. They're bombing school. But hey, like this person just made a manager at their company, and they sometimes what I'll notice is that they won't even acknowledge what's going on at home because it's such a. And I think maybe this is part of the problem, which is like when you mentioned before, when your computer breaks, I know the computer guy knows how to fix it. When your car breaks down, I've got a mechanic, I know he knows how to fix it. When my kid breaks, there's a billion different things that could be wrong there, and I don't know how to fix it. And it might start to encroach on me. And I think there's almost a bit of like an ego in there where people might say like, well, I was a good father. I was a good mother. I raised my kid with like, like I don't see how my kid being involved in drugs and alcohol could be my fault.
Right.
It's like, I worked hard. I worked 80, 90 hours a week to give him this. And it's like, yeah, the kid didn't need more money. He needed you.
right.
That's what's missing.
Totally. And when I first started my practice, I worked pretty much only with children because that's what I really wanted to do when I first started. Um, and I would say that 99% of the children that were referred to me for therapy, there was nothing wrong with them. They were suffering from conflict in the home and usually
Mm,
between their parents, and most often from a conflictual and unresolved divorce.
yeah.
And they were just caught in the crossfire. And so and they became symptomatic as a way. They didn't know they were doing this, but in the world of psychology we understand this dynamic. They were calling for help for the family. Just like if you're eating really bad food, some part of your body is going to become symptomatic, some organ is going to shut down or not
Hmm.
work properly or cause you pain, and that's the body's way of telling you something needs to change here, something. And this organ is the one that's calling for help for the whole body.
Yeah.
And we're the same way. And I think what we need to know is the most symptomatic people in our society are doing the same thing for the larger family system of America or the world. They're not just bad people, they're not born evil. They've been conditioned in some way that's severely deleterious to their ultimate ability to be appropriate adults and safe people.
Yeah, I'm interested in in the context of the family dynamic too. It's there. I think what's happening in modern day in the world is this assault on. I guess because what ends up happening in a lot of cases is that when people hear an idea or a topic, they tend to take it to its extreme and then attack the extreme rather than look at
Right.
the majority. And
Mm,
one thing you mentioned in the book, I believe, in the Light in the Darkness, the book, that the feminine is receptive and the masculine is assertive.
hmm.
And I think in the context, like especially what's happening in modern day and age, is that we're attacking. We think, I guess, taken to extremes. We're attacking traditional family structures and not realizing that there might be certain values. I'm curious, like, what your personal definition might be of like femininity or masculinity, because in even the context of like growing up, I've heard about and read this a lot with child dynamics and kids growing up is how it's like first couple years of life, it's generally mostly the mom doing a lot of the heavy lifting, more or less, minus the dad comes in to help out and do things. Not that he's not there, but he's changing diapers, but it's like a lot of like love and caring and nurturing and receptive is mostly mom in some capacity. And then at some point, it starts to gradually shift into like dad or the masculine kind of stepping in to say like, okay, I'm going to start beating up a little bit. I want you to know, I want you to show you that you can take it. You're tougher than you think you are. Maybe like emotional regulation, but I'm curious what your interpretation is or what your definition might be of like, masculine, feminine, and then like that in the context of the household, because of the context of the family unit, and how that then maybe translates into producing a well-rounded person who then repeats the process into the
Right.
future.
Well, I think, I think it's not totally cut and dry that the woman is just has the feminine
Yes. Yeah,
energy and the
yeah,
man
yeah.
just has the masculine. But I think what we're seeing and what we're starting to understand from looking at the way people develop, whether it's healthy or not, is that um, we each, whether you're a man or a woman, we both have both energies.
Yes, yes, I agree with
And
that, yeah.
that mental health is, whether you're a woman or a man, part of mental health is having some kind of balance. So
Mhm.
a woman's generative, inclusive, kind of nurturing, receptive energies are in balance for her with an assertive side, an active side.
Yeah.
And I think this is what, feminism was all about. Don't relegate me to just be the housewife. I have a drive to be in the world. I want to express myself I want to have other kinds of action in the world besides being a nurturer or a caregiver. And that may be an oversimplification of feminism, um, and I think for men, I think men suffer when they don't feel like they can express their more feminine qualities or
Mhm.
embody them. And so I think one of the things that came out of the whole feminist movement was permission for men to express more of their feminine side and women to express more of their masculine energies to create a balance. It might have swung too far, in the pendulum might have swung too far, because that's what sometimes happens when we figure something new out, but it's beginning to come back to the middle, at least for some people.
Yeah.
And so you see in some young people, and I don't know what the statistics are, and I don't know, I doubt it's a majority, but where men are becoming more of caregivers also of their children, and women are finding more success and activity outside of their home in their careers. But it's the balance that really matters. And I read a very profound thing in one of the books I read on addiction when I was in graduate school. And what it said was that people who have a really good active balance of the masculine and feminine within their own nature tend not to become addicted.
Mm.
And I thought that was really interesting. It's almost like the addiction is trying to heal some kind of, or make up for some kind of wound that actually really needs to be healed psychologically and emotionally. I thought that was just really, really interesting.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree with the balancing act thing too, and the addiction. I was just the other day. I heard this really good quote. It was like, the opposite of addiction is community.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I love it. Because look at that. That's men and women working together in cooperation.
Yes, and not a sudden. This is where the extremes comes into play, and I think what you're seeing, even in modern day and age, like a good example of this I'm trying to cover in a podcast, is the fact that the dating scene is collapsing, it's falling apart, it's a disaster right now, and part of the problem is this technological over exaggeration of certain qualities of the mating process.
Oh,
That
interesting.
that's at least that's kind of the way I'm seeing it. I've heard it discussed before, in that it's like, well, okay, maybe a woman likes a guy who's tall and muscular. Okay, but does he have does he have other qualities? Like, if you compare, it's like, okay, tall and muscular is nice quality, but if you look at nothing else, he can be hiding a lot of evil crap under there. Whereas you might find the next guy is not as tall, not as, muscular, but really good caretaker, really nice, receptive, caring, X, Y, and Z. And that what the algorithms do in the dating scene, they tend to really over exaggerate certain qualities. And that, traditionally speaking, I think what would happen on a larger scale, even among other species, is like, more, let's say, like, masculine is assertive, feminine is receptive. It's like men would just do whatever women wanted them to do in order to get them to like them, because kind of like we were generally the ones chasing in some capacity, and women would basically say, like, okay, I want you to jump, and men would be like, how high? I'll figure it out. Just tell me how high you want me to jump. But what a lot of the dating apps, what they'll do is that they'll not say blend, filter a man down to just, how tall are you? What kind of job do you have? How much, are you in good shape? Can you take a good photograph? And that completely wipes out all the other things. Because I'm sure there's plenty of people out there have seen, like, couples where they'll see, like, a really attractive woman with like a guy who's like, woof, and she's like, what does she see in him? Like, he's probably like the funniest, nicest, caring, most lovable guy you've ever met in your life. But you wouldn't know that if you only judged him on his appearances like that.
Right.
And how it's starting to create even like movements where it's like the feminism movement was a good way to say, like, okay, we have more to offer the world than just, being a housewife. Totally fair. But then it goes too far where it says, like, well, being a housewife is actually horrible. You're not even like, it's like being like a mother is a terrible thing to do. You shouldn't even bother with that. And the counterculture tends to be like things like the red pill movement, where men basically say, well, all these women only want this, this, and this, and therefore, like, men need to become the ultra mega chad that they can be and start hooking up with everybody across the board. And it creates, like you said, it's like like a tip too far one way, and now it's tipping far back the other way. And somewhere or another, we're going to have to either figure out how to reclaim some degree of old school metrics of how we go about meeting people, about meeting, like, a pairing up, creating stable family structures without looking at the extremes. Because I think when you get the extremes, like with sorry to cut you off, like with the dating apps, my go-to line is like, we're basically trying to resurrect Genghis Khan. Like, one man is going to have 500 wives at the rate we're going. Because even with the dating apps, what's really interesting, there's some statistics that were revealed from behind the scenes of the dating apps of the companies, was like 90% of the women are swiping right on 10% of the guys, because you could filter by, is he over 6 foot? Does he make over $100,000 a year? Does he do this? Well, what about the guy who's 5'11", who makes $95,000 a year, who, like, drives a
Yeah.
pretty nice car, but not a Lamborghini. Is he good enough for you? And then
Hmm.
it's the problem is that it's targeting a part of your brain that's like, realistically, I want to see like, is he good looking? Okay. Is he pretty tall? Okay. Is he pretty muscular, decently in shape? Okay. Like some things you kind of tick off the boxes, and then it kind of gets filled in with like, but he's also nice and he's good with his family and he's good with kids and he works hard. Even if he's not a millionaire, that's pretty good. And it kind of, you kind of fill out a bunch of different boxes, but now it's saying like, we only want you to look at this, this, and this, and nothing else.
Hmm.
And it starts to cause this problem across the board.
I think, I mean, I don't know for sure, but I think it might be true in the reverse as well. That women feel the same way. That it's how big your boobs are and what
Oh yeah.
shape is
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
butt,
Yeah.
and the same kind of thing. Like I've had friends on dating apps who've read to me some of what men say they're looking for. That I want a woman basically who's 20 years younger than me, who has red hair and good legs. And there's really profiles like that, and so I think what's so difficult about, in one way, the dating apps make it possible to meet people you'd never meet otherwise. And I know people who are happily married to people they met on a dating app. Um, on the other hand, when you meet a person in person, you get a vibe from them that you don't get from a photograph.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really, really missing. That we have all kinds of sense perceptions that feel each other out. Does he feel safe to me? Does he feel comfortable? Does she feel welcoming? Do I feel, like I really want to talk with this person? And we're picking up all kinds of signals that are not just that you can't get from a photograph or even from words that somebody says. So there's, yes, I think that it's very limited. And when I've worked with people who have gone on dating apps, and I always say, meet the person as soon as possible in person, because you're going to know right away when you meet the person in person. And I've known people who go on this huge fantasy of communication with somebody they've never met, and it becomes just a fantasy of what they're hoping for, and then they meet the person and there's nothing there.
What's interesting with that too is that there, this is almost like the family dynamic too, and how this society is structured. I would speculate on some level what society and traditional values did, even like multi-generationally, was to prevent this degree of, we'll say, almost like extreme narcissistic, psychopathic, like genetics that was like kind of, I was trying to creep between the population. It's not gone yet. It may never be gone, but it's still kind of like out there in some capacity. And there's a good thing I remember hearing. It was talking
Can you
about,
define that? I'm not sure what you were referring to. Could you say what you mean by the narcissistic something?
meaning that I would say, so in the case of like, I've had multiple patients that come through massage who have been sexually assaulted viciously, and just about every time they've talked to the story to me, they'll tell me the details and everything and like how it happened. 9 times out of 10, then they had no idea it was coming. They had
Right.
no clue. They
Right.
had no idea, like, this guy who was super sweet and super nice and caring and kind and considerate and very well spoken was hiding this like demon, this monster in them somewhere. And my personal theory around that is like, traditionally, we may have met people through people we know in the town, in the vicinity, in
Well,
your church, and your friends and family, and they were part of the vetting process. So like
right.
maybe if you're a young girl and you're really just like, you're coming into puberty, your body's changing, you're getting all this attention from guys and you're kind of liking it. And this one really good looking guy comes up and starts talking to you and giving you the attention you want, but you don't realize that he has this capacity to like manipulate you and kind of slide past your barriers by saying things you want to hear or reading your body language or realizing it. I remember seeing this it was a podcast where it was a guy who was talking about how like he had a friend who basically, when he would go out, like, clubbing or whatever, within like 2 or 3 sentences, he could tell which girl had a poor relationship with her father or with some men in her life because of the way she would respond to like really sleazy pickup lines or bad jokes or a little like almost like an invasion of boundaries. And then
Wow.
she wouldn't back up. He would go like, that's the one I can go for, because the ones that knew how to establish boundaries and keep back were the ones that would say like, pick up right away, like, get the hell away from me. I'm getting a bad vibe from you. But those girls who weren't taught how to do that, or how to vet through their, maybe the men in their lives or the fathers in their lives, or even the mothers in their lives too, of learning how to filter out narcissists and psychos and like maybe really like rapists and things like that. That like other people around you could spot things you can't see. And that part of the problem,
Right.
I think, with like the dating apps and the current dating scene is that it allows these men, these people, to slip past the guards, so to speak, much easier than they did in the past. And then you start to get more and more stories of sexual assault from the same few guys, that then gets blanketed to the entire population of men, saying, "Oh, all men are, you know, horrible. All men are this. All women are that. All men are this. All women are that." When in reality, it's a very small percentage of people that traditionally we had a very good track record of keeping under control and out of the population, that have now found a way back in by bypassing the security guards.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that there's so many other contributing factors to what you're talking about that just pile on and make it more intense. And that is that there's so much pornography out
Oh my
there,
god,
and
yeah.
there's so much violence in the movies that has a lot to do with assaulting women. We have people in public office who have assaulted women and nothing happens to them. And, you know, so there's this sort of mushroom cloud of permission and kind of a coliseum kind of atmosphere where people are getting pleasure from watching other people be in pain. And so there are a lot of contributing factors. And I come back to what you talked about men and women. You know, when I think a lot of it comes back to the home. If
Yeah.
you have if you have men and women in relationship in a family, mother and father, who respect each other and who treat each other well, and that's the role model for, you know, loving your wife and loving your husband and working out conflict in a way that your children can see that
Yeah.
it's possible to work out conflict without hurting each other or hitting anyone, or calling names, that you internalize a good feeling about who you are and how you're supposed to treat other people, and you don't become the rapist. You
Yeah.
know, unless perhaps, you know, there's some other outside influences that are just really noxious and take over. But I think we have to look at how do we make the family healthy so that we produce healthy human beings who don't have these demonic and horrible destructive vibes and impulses.
Yeah, and even in the context of, you can think of it almost like a genetic roll of the dice, that there may still be people born who just have, like you said, some really bad combination of personality traits from just a genetic level. They're just like
Right.
out for blood day one. And that historically, like the one thing that comes to mind, I think I remember, I think I was learning about this thing. It was something in regards to like Joseph Stalin, and how they talked about his like childhood, how even as a child he was like really effing messed up, really
Mm,
messed up dude. But I wonder if in like today's day and age, like there are still people, young kids who are being born who have the capacity on like a personality basis, genetic level, to just be the next Stalin, but they don't make it to the top of the hierarchy because of the systems and the
right.
processes in the world that prevent them from getting that high, that are starting to be degraded, that are allowing the wrong people, like you said, people holding public office who have done like literal sexual assault and whatnot, who are just basically people like, yeah, whatever, it's just, we'll let him slide because he's a good guy. He's convincing. He's very charming. He's got good charisma about him. He's very well spoken. It's like, you know, he did some terrible things, but if enough people start to normalize it, then these
Right.
guys start creeping through, and then it start causing like almost a catastrophe at its top, and the whole thing starts to tip over. So I wonder if what you're seeing today in today's day and age.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's what's happening. I think we have to become very discerning about what helps people be mentally and emotionally healthy, which creates, you know, boundaried, caring behaviors so that that we know that we matter, but we matter within the context of everyone mattering. You know,
Yeah.
and so like my behavior is in balance with what my impact is on the people around me. And the more and more narcissism you have kind of flagrantly taking center stage in social media and the news and politics and all of that, the more there's permission, you know, for that kind of, it's what I want and I just am entitled to it and it doesn't matter my impact on other people. And I think that's a lot of what we see, and it's a mental health issue, and that's what I keep trying to say. It's a mental health issue. Um, and it needs attention from the point of view of how do we heal people. Again, and yes, there are people we don't know how to heal, whether it's a genetic imbalance or they're so damaged by what happened to them early in life that we simply just don't know how to treat them and bring them back to some kind of safe, constructive way of being. Yeah, those people we probably have to incarcerate, but that doesn't mean that we can't be human toward them and that we can't still try to help them. And know that there's probably the vast majority of people out there who are able to be helped with the right help. And if we were investing in people rather than in weapons, for one thing, and many other things. And the only other thing I wanted to say is that, this isn't my area of expertise, but our food supply is very compromised. And so when children are being fed terrible food from a very early age, I think that also impacts their emotional and behavioral well-being.
I can speak to the food thing for hours if you let me. I had growing up, I had a lot of dietary issues, a lot of digestive issues, and it wasn't until years later that I realized, like, when I was growing up, it wasn't even for lack of resources or money in the house. It was just simplicity. And this is an interesting thing that kind of ties back into like this value around certain roles in like in the household of like having somebody cooking regular meals. Maybe more traditionally it was women. There's a whole discussion as to why that would have been, but still having somebody who's regularly cooking like home cooked meals and why people value it so much. Because growing up, and like my parents know this, and I talked about it, like how it was like Monday would have been like pizza, Tuesday was Chinese food, Wednesday was like KFC, Thursday was like home cooked chicken, but it was like deep fried in canola oil and whatnot. And then Friday was like leftovers. Why? Because we were all running around 24/7. It was just easy to just throw something in the microwave or just to reheat it and have an order. And even nowadays, you're getting things like DoorDash. And I had this discussion with a friend of mine, and I've been kind of building on this idea a little bit of like, we have a problem in today's Western society of like productivity creep, where it's like we're taking time away from other areas of your life to get more productivity out of you, but it's costing you in ways that you don't see. And a good example of that would be something like food shopping. Like a lot of people who like to do Instacart nowadays, where you're basically just press a button online and all of a sudden your entire shopping list is ready to go. You show up, you grab it, you leave. But what are you giving up in the process? You don't have the time to kind of like almost have a bit of like personal therapy where you get to like slowly walk around, just chill out a little bit. Maybe if it's a local supermarket, you know people, you can bump in and have a conversation of some sort. If you have little kids get to practice socializing in public and behaving and learning and just getting control of their emotion and their own urges and whatnot. All of that just gets wiped out with the click of a button. And then other things in life where you're basically saying like, oh, we could just have DoorDash or Uber Eats. They'll just bring food immediately. Because why? Because I don't have any patience to cook. It's like, well, do you have the time to cook? What are you doing with the time? Watching Netflix. Or you could be learning how to like cook something, and it slows you down, it calms you down, it's therapeutic. It's you're learning of the methodology, the ingredients, what you like, what you don't like, how to do things, how to cook stuff. And also there's a certain personal feeling of gratification when somebody else consumes something that you produced that like they feel good, and it makes me feel like, oh, I made that and you feel good because of the thing that I made for you. That just like warms your heart in a way that nothing else can. And how it's like, well, we need you to work extra hours. What do I have to do? Now I have to order out food, and all of that gets wiped out as a result.
Right. And I think it's part of feeding each other, like feeding each other on a food level, feeding each other good emotional food, feeding each other good mental food. And a lot of that happens for some people around a meal. We're conversing. A lot of people have their TV on now while they're eating, and I think we just don't know that it's not good food. It's just, I really think a lot of people don't know it's not good food. And I think they really don't know how it's affecting the brains of their children. And I don't know how it's affecting the brains of their children on a scientific level, but I know it is, because what we're taking in affects the way our brains respond, the neural pathways we're creating, but to say nothing of the role models you might be seeing on TV and the imagery. So, I think this is all part of educating each other like educating each other. What's really healthy for human beings? Do you really need a 60-inch TV? Or,
Yeah, the food thing, just to dive back what I was saying, is that when I had a lot of digestive issues and I went to gastroenterologists and different doctors and I had medications and whatnot. And I also had a lot of social anxiety and a bit of like moderate depression, which my mother had pretty severe depression. And it was a number of things that happened in my childhood, but also we were eating crap food all the time. And it wasn't until
right.
years later that I kind of stumbled on like keto and like very protein heavy diet. But I do a
Mm,
lot of like red
mhm.
meat. And anyone who hears what my diet is literally like a steak, ground beef, like a pound of ground beef, eggs and bacon, and a protein shake like every day. And I've never felt better in my life. I feel amazing.
Mhm.
Not saying you should do
Yeah.
that or anybody should do that, but
Mhm.
when I cut out processed foods within about 2 weeks, because I wanted to experiment with the diet. I just figured I always heard like red meat's gonna give me a heart attack. Let me just try it out for 2 weeks. It's not gonna kill me. My anxiety fell off a cliff, disappeared completely. My social anxiety
Yeah.
vanished. My depression disappeared. I lost about 10, 15 pounds. I was
Right.
sleeping better. My libido was better. My energy in the morning, I didn't need caffeine anymore. I wasn't taking midday naps anymore. And a big one
Wow.
for me was also like my ability to think quickly. It came back. Whereas before it was like I'd have like 3 or 4 different thoughts I want to say at the same time, and they would all compete for space. So I might be like, say, if
Mhm.
I saw you in person, I'd be like, hey, hi, how are you doing? What's up? That would be like, hey, wujuwaja. So it would just all kind of blend together into one word, and they'd be like, what did you say? And I'd be mumbling a lot because almost like also what I've noticed, which is crazy, is that my tongue swells up a very slight amount. But I have like apparently when I was told as a kid, I have a tongue that's too big for my mouth. So when I have flick off the back of my teeth to create certain sounds, like at times when I was younger, it would be difficult to create the
Oh,
m sounds.
yeah.
But when I changed my diet, that vanished. And I've noticed
Wow.
that when I eat crap food, I eat processed food, my tongue swells up, and my ability to pronunciate certain words and sounds gets
Wow.
messed up. And not only so, yeah, like my if I eat junk food, if I eat junk food, and the next day I wake up and just like I feel like crap. Life sucks. This is terrible. I'll sit there and be like, oh, that's right. I had Chipotle yesterday. Okay, everything's fine. That's what the problem is right now. Okay, yeah,
Right.
it's not actually
Right.
as bad as I think it is. My thoughts become like toxic. My passive thoughts, my self critique goes through the roof. My inner critic starts going nuts. And then when I start eating clean, even though it's like maybe not like it gets boring after a while doing nothing but steak and like it sounds good on paper, but nothing but steak and ground beef every day, it gets kind of boring after a while. But my productivity is tenfold. I feel amazing.
Mm,
A big
mm.
thing for me for massage therapy is that my hands used to get like really, really painful at the end of the day. And I thought I had arthritis. I thought my career was done within like 2 years. And I cut out carbs mostly. I cut out like potatoes, rice, bread. I can do like 7, 8 hours a day now, no problem. I feel nothing. It feels great. My body's ability to recover is tremendous. So in the case of the mental health thing, absolutely. I've seen plenty of people over the years that like I've talked to or friends I've had or people in my family where they change their diet and their personality changes.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you know that with children, if they're eating junk food and sugar and, they can be really hyperactive and crash. Right. Yeah, but I think one of the beautiful things that you're talking about is that you're listening to your body. If you were eating that diet and you were having horrible reaction, you wouldn't eat it. You wouldn't eat that diet. So your body is telling you this works for me. And I think we're all really born with very intuitive senses about many things, about people, about what we need, about what our particular personality is called to. Maybe I'm really called to nursing or writing or being an artist or being a scientist, or I just want to be a mother or whatever. I think we all have a sense of what's good for us. And it's not the same for every person, but we're really not learning, and I don't think necessarily teaching our children to listen. What do you want? What are you feeling? Do you love, if you love drawing that picture, do you want to take an art class? Not pushing you to be an artist, but you know what I mean? Like that seems to be something you're really interested in. I really wanted you to be a doctor, but it sounds like you want to be an artist. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
And I think we have that, and that's part of mental health, is being supported to tune into your own inner guidance. what is your psyche, what is your spirit, what is your heart and your mind telling you about what's good for you? Because I think the more people are encouraged and supported to listen on that level, also the more safe we are for each other, because we're fulfilled. We get to be who we really are, instead of trying to fit some box that society or our family or our community is telling us we should fit into, that really doesn't belong to us.
Yeah. Funny enough, my own personal story. I started at college. I went to college for marine sciences. I transferred over to engineering, and I actually have a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering, which I actually never ended up using. Although I did look for some jobs, I realized very quickly by looking into the jobs and people in those jobs that it was just a lot of like desk work, not interacting with anybody, and a
Oh,
lot of people just like gained a tremendous like they'd be like bald and diabetic by the time they were like 45. Like, hey, I've got good money. And I kind of had this sense of like, I don't know if I want that for my life. So I ended up, while I was in college, got really big into health and wellness and health and fitness, got
yeah.
into personal training when I left college, which eventually transformed into massage therapy for a story that involves my mother, who passed away about 10 years ago. And then that is where I've been now, which then in massage therapy, I realized I really enjoy talking to people. I enjoy long form conversation like we're having right now. And I have an above average ability to read people's emotional state from their body language and their words and their facial cues and
Right.
things like that. I'm trying to step into now into like coaching, mentoring type things because of the therapy degree. What I've heard personally from like the therapy degrees in schools nowadays have come a little bit, kind of gone a little bit off the rails. What's going on right now? But yeah, it took a long time to kind of figure out like where my natural strengths were after I also changed the diet and realized what my personality was and who I actually was when I'm healthy, when I'm working out, I'm eating clean and I feel good. Who am I? And then can I take that and
Mm,
translate it into a productive thing that's going to give back to society while also be somewhat financially functional in the long term? And a lot of people, I think what they'll use, especially nowadays, I think what you're seeing is a lot of there's a massive gap right now in the trades, in the age of people entering the trades in the past 20, 30, 40 years, because we've had 40, 50 plus years of people saying like, if you don't go to college, you're stupid. If you don't go to college, you're not going to succeed. And now we're like, where are all the carpenters? Where are all the plumbers? Where are all the construction guys? What happened? My lights are off. Where's an electrician? Like, oh, we told them to go to college. And now we're all wondering why the lights aren't on and like why my house is falling apart. And yeah, like you said, it's just people don't have this opportunity to explore what they could be good at because they're looking at like, well, you could be a doctor. Do
mm-hmm.
you enjoy being a doctor? Do you enjoy medicine? Do you enjoy working 14, 16-hour shifts? Maybe you do. If you do, awesome, go for it.
Right.
But if you don't, it can be tough when there's like this social stigma around certain professions because it's like you have to get a lot of money, and the amount of men and women that get a ton of money in their careers and they don't focus on their family, they don't focus on their passions, and they're millionaires and they're miserable.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
how often it happens?
Yeah. And then that value gets passed on to their children. Not like,
Yes.
who are you and what are you really about and what lights you up? But you got to follow in these footsteps.
Yeah, I have a friend of mine who is a paramedic, and she works in a very, very, very affluent area near us. Like I live in kind of like a middle class neighborhood, but she works in a very affluent area. And the amount of phone calls that they get for teenagers that are overdosing on prescription drugs because the parents are too busy working their 90, 100-hour work weeks to make sure they still have the mansion that they have. And the
Yeah.
parents are just completely absent from the kids' lives. Or I've had people I know
Yeah.
who are like nannies and au pairs and whatnot, and like how disconnected the parents are from their kids because they're working because they had to hire somebody to raise their kids because they had to
Right.
keep up with the Joneses and keep up with this
Right.
like this really like
Right.
affluent lifestyle.
Right.
And this comes out to that question from before of like, what are you paying to have this lifestyle? Like, what are you giving up elsewhere in your life to have this super? Not that you shouldn't be ambitious and work hard and improve the world and technology, but at the same time, it's like this machine that is the village is starting to break down because you're putting too much emphasis into one direction and not enough in another direction, which is the next generation of kids coming through.
Right. And all the other side of that being all the people left at the bottom who can't make a living wage, who
That's a
can't
big one.
take care
Yeah.
of their families, who, no matter how hard they work, they can't be there. Or they're just living in poverty, and then they're condemned by our society for being lazy and entitled and whatever. And so, yeah, I mean, the imbalance, and I think that the reporting on the growing imbalance and the loss of a middle class is creating symptomatics on all ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. Yeah, my little personal theory around that is like I think traditionally the most functional society tends to be like almost like a straight line, like not like a straight line, but maybe like a bit of a curve where it kind of flattens in the middle, where like the opportunity to enter the middle class should not be ridiculously high, but it should be
Right.
something where you're doing something productive for the world around you. And then if you want to really hit upper class, like, all right, you're going to have to really do something crazy above and beyond, working 2 jobs on a brand new product no one's ever thought of. But it's opportunities there. But then the divide between the two is like getting so wide where like we heard this term, the wealth gap, and not to get into like any kind of like anti-capitalistic type of methodologies, but there is a point where you basically say like every functional society had a large enough people in the population who were pretty much doing like middle class type stuff to support the system itself. But then when you try to extract too much opportunity from the next generation of people coming through, like in the case of like the inflation problem right now, or the cost of living is through the roof, and also really like a good example with social media that pops into mind is like how back in the day with cigarettes, we weren't allowed to have the images of like Joe Camel at eye level for kids when they walk into a convenience store. But now with things like social media, like that Joe Camel picture is right back again. There's nothing stopping the algorithm from figuring out, oh, this kid likes this and this, and he's 9, 10, 11 years old. We're going to be able to figure out. There was a crazy story I heard about. It was a guy whose daughter was receiving like coupons from Target. And there were coupons specifically for like baby diapers or something like baby formula. And he got really pissed off because he was like, what the F? Like, why is my 14, 15, 16-year-old daughter getting these coupons? And then he found out later on that she was actually pregnant. But it was based on her buying behaviors that they figured, oh, you're buying folic acid, which means in about 2 to 3 months from now, you're probably going to be looked to start putting money towards like baby stuff. They could actually kind of like almost narrow down where she was in the pregnancy and what she's going to want to buy next based on what she's bought so far. And how it's getting so far ahead of people that it's going to start conditioning people to start buying things and have an impulse to buy things that they don't even realize like why they want to buy. It's like, oh, you bought an iPhone. You're going to be really interested in the next iPhone and an iPhone case and these fancy AirPods that go into your ear and all this other stuff. And also we could do like a buy now, pay later, so you can just start racking up credit card debt. And then when you're in your mid 20s and 30s, you can't afford to buy a house or a car. You're wondering what the hell happened. It's like, well, we screwed you over 10 years ago because we were trying to pull money out of you now, basically.
And I think what you're speaking to is, again, a skewed value system, that money and possession and the greed that fuels people to play on your unconscious impulses or your needs, that people are actually feeding on that and getting rich off of it. And again, it's at what cost to individuals and to the whole society? What is the world our children going to inherit?
Yeah. There's a really good term for that I've heard, and it was a book. It's called Limbic Capitalism, where basically we're specifically targeting your limbic system in order to pull more money out of you. And if anyone's ever had the idea of like where capitalism should be constrained or should be stopped, like my personal opinion is like that's where you draw the line. And a good example of limbic capitalism would be things like pornography or social media for young women, or like a big one I see is a lot of girls. Like I've had ex-girlfriends who were just like, I thought they weren't Giselle supermodels, but they're very attractive to me. But I think they have this body image issue where it's like, well, I'm still not thin enough. I'm not like my legs are too big and my torso's too big, and I'm just the one saying like I find you attractive. Like, yeah, but I don't find myself attractive because I don't know why. Like, but the reason is why you walk past billboards of like super skinny, like size 0 models wearing like tight bikinis and digitally enhanced butts that don't even actually exist. And the guys are walking along thinking like, that's what I want. And the girls are thinking, that's what I had to look like or else I'm a bad person. And it's not where the real world lives at all by any means. And it's starting to, like I said, starting to target that limbic system. And it's really starting to cause ripple effects in society in crazy ways.
Yeah, and it leaves people not feeling good about who they are, bottom line. And when you don't feel good about who you are and you're never enough, then that's the energy you bring to your life. And it wreaks havoc on people. I mean, people just live in a lot of emotional pain over these things.
Yeah, it's crazy. So, sort of wrap things up a little bit. Your next book is America in Therapy. What's the theme? What's the idea behind the book?
So the theme of American Therapy is looking at our country, I call it the family of America, through the lens of family systems. What creates a healthy family? What are the dynamics in a healthy family? What are the dynamics in a dysfunctional or abusive family? And are we living in our country with some of the dynamics of an abusive family coming down from the top, as well as influencing us in our individual homes? Because I think that the level of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse and neglect in our country, in our homes, is actually high. I think a lot of people are suffering a lot that we don't see. And then they bring that to their workplace and they act it out with their employers or their employees or their colleagues, or in their churches or in their schools or in, wherever they are in their community, as well as in their homes. And so if we are, as a country, perpetrating some of those dysfunctional and abusive dynamics toward whole segments of our population, the poor, sometimes women, children being deprived of some of the necessities that they need, people not being able to get the medical care or the education or the other kinds of psychological help that they need, then we're functioning like a dysfunctional and sometimes abusive family. And we can expect to see lots of symptomatic people. And the only way to break that cycle is to actually address our family dynamics on a national as well as a personal level, and implement some of the changes that would actually set us up to be healthier, be happier, be safer, and be more functional, cooperative, and nonviolent human beings. And we know this is possible. Nothing's perfect. Human beings are complex. Our psyches are all, unique and individual, but we know patterns and we know basically what helps people feel good and feel peaceful and be cooperative and nonviolent. And we know basically what helps people heal when they've suffered abuse and neglect. And we just don't necessarily employ that on a national level. And what would it be like if we actually made that part of our policy? And so I talk about diagnosing the family of America from a family systems point of view, what we can expect if we don't change some of the ways we treat each other that are really, really abusive and sometimes violent. And how can we bring some of the best of what's healing that we found helps individuals and families? How can we bring that into our national political scene, into our into society and culture, and actually promote mental health and well-being, as not just because it's good and kind and it helps people, but because I think our survival might depend on it. Because the more violent we become, and the more numb we become to the effects of our violence, we're set up to continue war and devastation and the devastation of the planet.
Yeah, that's a that's a good way to summarize it. Yeah, that's a very good perspective of thinking of America as one big dysfunctional family, and why we can't figure out why these black sheep in the family keep popping up, and
Right.
the one cousin falls into drug abuse, and the other cousin falls into a bad relationship, and then just like, well, we were good parents, weren't we? And it turns out like, no, there's some things missing in the system. When does that book come out?
July 2nd.
July 2nd. Perfect.
Yeah. It's also already available, though. You can order it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It's available for pre-order now.
Perfect. Well, Phyllis, thank you very much for your time. This is an amazing conversation. I'm looking forward to hopefully
Thank
reading that book and
you.
then having another conversation about that in the
I
future.
would love it. I would just love it. Thank you so much. You've been an amazing host, and I've
Thank you.
appreciated every minute. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. If you found us informative, thought-provoking, or learned something new, please leave a review or a comment and tell a friend about the podcast. Feedback means the world to me, as I want to make this the best possible podcast that it can be, and to help others identify the causes of and solutions to problems in their own lives and villages. Until next time, let's keep working on rebuilding the village.